The afternoon light in Ashwick Hall's long gallery had a particular quality in November, thin and pale, the kind of light that did not flatter anyone. Constance Rowe had always thought it suited her perfectly. She was not at the pianoforte when Lord Ashwick arrived with his guest, though she was close enough to hear the door open and the creak of 2 sets of boots on the polished floor. She did not look up from the letter she was copying, her hand moving in careful, unhurried strokes across the page. The steward's accounts required her attention by 3:30, and she had learned in her 8 months at Ashwick Hall that the accounts would not wait for guests. "There she is," said Lord Ashwick, and his voice held the particular brightness of a man presenting something amusing. "The Hall's most reliable fixture. Miss Rowe, allow me to present Mr. Gideon Hartwell, of Hartwell Park in Oxfordshire." She set down her pen. She rose. She turned. The man standing beside Lord Ashwick was tall in the way that certain men of rank carry themselves without awareness of it, as though the world had simply agreed to be shorter than they were. He was perhaps 34, dark-haired, with a jaw that might have been handsome were it not held at precisely the angle of a man who has decided in advance not to be impressed. His eyes moved over the long gallery with the unhurried assessment of a guest taking inventory, and when they arrived at Constance, they did not quite pause. "Miss Rowe," he said with a bow so slightly abbreviated that it communicated courtesy and dismissal in a single motion. "Ashwick tells me you manage the household correspondence." "Among other duties," she said. Lord Ashwick laughed at something only he had heard and steered his friend toward the fire, and Constance turned back to her letter. She heard Lord Ashwick say, low enough to seem private, but not low enough to actually be so, "Poor thing has been here since March. Cousin's widow, no money to speak of. One of those useful, quiet women one acquires without quite intending to. You know the type." She did not hear Mr. Hartwell's reply. She did not need to. This was not the first time a guest had appraised her and moved on. It would not be the last. Constance Rowe, at 28 years old, had been acquainted with that particular variety of dismissal for long enough that she recognized its shape the way one recognizes the silhouette of a familiar house at dusk. She had been a curate's daughter before she was a curate's wife, and a curate's widow before she was anything else. And the sum of those positions had left her in a place the world had no precise name for. Not a servant, not quite a guest, not a member of any family, and not a prospect for any member of any family. She was, as Lord Ashwick had accurately, if unkindly observed, useful. She picked up her pen and continued writing. If it would please you to know what manner of woman held that pen, here is the accounting. The gallery's thin November light offered a woman in gray wool, plain cut, the collar resting precisely at her throat. Hair the color of dark honey, dressed without ornament, because ornament cost money, and she had none. A face that had been described, once, by a kind man now buried in Oxfordshire, as the sort of face that asked questions. Eyes of an indeterminate color, the kind that shifted between gray and green depending on the weather, and could not be conveniently categorized. Hands that showed the work she did. She was thin in the way of women who had learned to be careful with expenses, including the expense of food when there was not enough of it. She was, by the world's current arithmetic, a spinster. She had no objection to the word. It was accurate. What she could not have told you, as the November light fell across the page, was that the man by the fire was watching her. He did it the way he had been watching things all his life, without appearing to watch at all. Lord Ashwick was pouring wine and speaking about hunting. and Gideon Hartwell held his glass and listened, or gave the appearance of listening, and watched the woman at the writing table copy a letter with the kind of precision that suggested the letter mattered to her. She did not hunch over the page the way people did when they wanted to disappear. She sat straight. Her free hand held the paper flat against the table, one finger at the corner to stop it from shifting. He turned back to Lord Ashwick and said something appropriate about the hunting, and did not think about her again until dinner. Dinner at Ashwick Hall was the usual thing for a country house in November, a table set for 12 with only 7 present, the silence filled by the rattle of silver and the steward's third wife's opinions about the church pew arrangements. Constance sat at the far end, between the steward and the elderly Miss Pemberton, who was someone's aunt and had been positioned there by Lord Ashwick with the casualness of a man placing furniture. She did not contribute to the general conversation, except when addressed. And when she was addressed, she answered clearly, and without padding the answer with apology. Gideon, from his position at Lord Ashwick's right hand, noted this, without intending to. He also noted that Miss Pemberton's wine-glass was empty, and that none of the footmen had moved to refill it, and that Constance reached quietly across the corner of the table and refilled it herself before the old woman noticed. No one else at the table observed this. Constance returned her attention to her own plate without any expression that suggested she had done anything. He did not note any of this, he would have said. It simply registered. After dinner, when the men had finished their port and joined the women in the drawing-room, Lord Ashwick said, with the satisfied air of a host producing entertainment, "Miss Rowe, Hartwell has been telling me he finds charitable works quite dull. You might convince him otherwise. You are the one always going into the village, are you not?" It was said in the voice of a man setting up a game, offering someone else as the target. Gideon had heard that voice before, had perhaps used it himself. He watched Constance to see what she would do with it. She looked at Lord Ashwick for one moment with an expression that understood exactly what was being offered, and then she turned to Gideon and said, without either aggression or apology, "What sort of charity troubles you, Mr. Hartwell? The kind that costs money, or the kind that costs time?" He found himself unexpectedly without an immediate answer. "Most men dislike the second," she said, not unkindly. "Money is easy to give. Time requires you to be in the same room as the problem, which is less comfortable." Lord Ashwick laughed, the slightly too loud laugh of a man uncertain whether the joke had landed correctly. "She is always like this," he said to Gideon. "Quite forthright. One of her charming peculiarities." "Indeed," said Gideon. He was not looking at Lord Ashwick. The following morning he rode out before breakfast, which was his habit and the only reliable method he had ever found of clearing his head. He rode south along the estate road, through the bare-branched wood, and emerged onto the lane that ran down toward the village. He did not plan to go to the village. He went because the horse preferred the downhill path. He found her in the village before he found anything else. She was standing outside a cottage at the lane's edge, speaking with a woman who had 3 young children arranged around her in varying states of disorder. She was not speaking to the woman in the voice that comfortable people used for the poor, that particular elevated tenderness that contains its own condescension. She was speaking in the ordinary voice of someone discussing a practical matter, and the woman was listening with the attention given to someone who might actually help. Gideon pulled the horse to a walk. Constance had brought a basket. He could see that from where he sat. She set it inside the cottage door without ceremony, and then she crouched down, in her gray wool dress, right there in the mud at the lane's edge. And she spoke directly to the eldest child, who could not have been more than 6. The child answered her with the seriousness that small children reserve for people they have decided to trust. Constance listened to the entire answer. She did not cut it short. She asked a follow-up question. Gideon sat on his horse in the lane for a moment longer than he had intended, and then rode back to the hall without making his presence known. She did not know he had seen. He preferred it that way, and could not have said why. The house party proper began that evening with the arrival of Lord Ashwick's sister, Mrs. Wrentham, who brought with her a daughter of 18, and the general opinion that certain arrangements had been too long deferred. She was a narrow woman with a wide manner and the ability to assess a room in a single slow glance, which she deployed on the drawing room the moment she entered it, and then deployed again, more lingeringly, on Constance. "Miss Rowe," she said, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, "how good of you to keep everything in order while we were away. You must be quite invaluable." "I try to be useful," Constance said. "Useful," Mrs. Wrentham repeated, as though she were filing the word for future reference. "Yes. What a fortunate thing, for a woman in your position." She moved on to greet her brother, and the conversation at the far end of the drawing room resolved into the kind of cheerful family noise that excluded everyone else. Constance turned to the tea tray and occupied herself with arranging cups that were already arranged. Gideon was standing near the window. He watched Mrs. Wrentham's performance, and then he watched Constance absorb it. And he observed that she did not absorb it with the rigid control of someone working hard not to show pain. She absorbed it the way a person absorbs a familiar thing, with the quiet, efficient competence of long practice. He did not like it. He was not sure why he was not sure why he did not like it. The days that followed settled into the rhythms of a country house in November, shooting in the mornings, drawing room in the evenings, the slow circular conversation of people who had run out of news. Gideon fell into the rhythm without intending to, and found himself, without explanation, measuring his mornings by whether Constance was in the long gallery when he passed through it after breakfast. She usually was. He had intended, when Lord Ashwick introduced her that first afternoon, to do what Ashwick had evidently planned for him, to observe the household's quiet, useful spinster with the brisk amusement of a man at a zoological exhibition, and to have something entertaining to say about her at breakfast. He had done this before at house parties, because it was easy, and because Ashwick had always appreciated that kind of wit, and because it cost nothing. He found, as the days passed, that he had nothing amusing to say. On the fourth day, he sat down uninvited at the other end of the long writing table while she was working on the household accounts. She did not ask him what he wanted. She set down her pen and looked at him with the patient expression of someone waiting to find out. "Those are the steward's accounts," he said, looking at the columns. "Yes." "You do them yourself?" "Lord Ashwick does not like figures," she said. It seemed practical to learn. He looked at the columns more carefully. They were meticulous, the kind of work that came from understanding what the numbers meant, rather than simply copying them from one column to another. He had not been a particularly attentive student of accounts himself until his father died, and he had been required to understand Hartwell Park's position very rapidly. The work in front of him was the work of someone who had been required to understand something quickly, and had done so without complaint. "Where did you learn?" he said. "My father kept his own parish accounts," she said. He could not afford a clerk. She paused. "And my husband's affairs were not in order when he died. I learned the rest then." It was said without self-pity and without invitation to discuss it further. He found he wanted to discuss it further, which surprised him. He did not, because she had already picked up her pen, which was answer enough. That evening, Mrs. Wrentham chose her position at the pianoforte and began to play with the fixed determination of a woman who has decided an entertainment is occurring, whether the room wants one or not. The company gathered with the polite attention of people who have no alternative, and Gideon stood near the fire and thought, for the first time in 3 days, about what he had come to Ashwick Hall to do. He had come because Lord Ashwick had invited him. He had come because November was the dead month. And Hartwell Park in November was a very particular variety of solitude. He had come because Lord Ashwick had mentioned that his young niece was visiting, and Gideon was 34 years old, and certain conversations had been occurring for 2 years about what Hartwell Park required by way of succession, and there had seemed no particular reason not to look. He looked now at Miss Wrentham, who was pretty in the uncomplicated way of girls of 18, who have not yet had occasion to be anything else. She sat beside her mother with her hands folded, and she smiled when smiled at. And she had said, during the 3 days of the house party, 17 things about the weather and 4 things about music, and nothing else that Gideon could recall. He looked at Constance, who was sitting in the chair nearest the lamp and reading something, and who had said nothing about the weather in 4 days. She turned a page without looking up. He had come to mock the spinster. He had said something unkind. That first evening, before the fire with Ashwick. The kind of easy unkindness that requires no particular cruelty, and therefore accumulates without anyone noticing its weight. He had said she was exactly the sort of woman who became indispensable because she had no alternative. He had said it as a social observation, not a judgment. He had said it with the same tone he used for most things, the smooth surface of a man who has not examined the underside of many opinions he holds. He set his wine-glass down on the mantelpiece and looked at it. She had not heard him say it. He was certain of that. And yet he was standing in front of the fire with the distinct sensation of a man who has said something he cannot unsay. He told himself it did not matter. She was useful, as Ashwick had said, and she was capable, and she would continue to be so after he had returned to Hartwell Park. And she had not heard him, and therefore was not harmed by it. And this was not the sort of scruple a sensible man entertained about a woman he had known for 4 days. He picked up his wine-glass and crossed the room and sat down in the chair nearest hers. "What are you reading?" he said. She looked up. For a moment she regarded him with the expression she had used the first evening, the one that understood more than it said. Then she turned the cover toward him. It was a treatise on drainage systems. The margins were covered in her handwriting. "For the East Field," she said. "The steward thinks it will not drain properly come spring, and he may be right. But I think the problem is further up the slope, and can be corrected without the cost he has quoted." Gideon looked at the margin notes. They were systematic and entirely correct. "He is charging you for work that does not address the actual problem," Gideon said. "Yes," she said. "I am trying to be certain before I say so." He sat with her for the rest of the evening while Mrs. Wrentham played, and they talked about drainage, which was not a subject he had discussed with a woman before. At 10 o'clock, the company began to retire, and he returned the treatise to her, and she thanked him with the particular brevity of someone who did not expect anything more. He did not sleep well. There are moments in certain lives when the architecture of a long-held opinion begins to develop a fault line, and it does not crack all at once but shifts, barely perceptibly, degree by degree, the way a foundation settles. Gideon lay in the dark at Ashwick Hall and catalogued, without quite intending to, everything he had observed in 5 days. The woman at the writing table who sat straight. The refilled wine-glass. The child who trusted her. The accounts done correctly without acknowledgement. The drainage treatise in the margin. The question at dinner that had left him without an answer. What sort of charity troubles you? The kind that costs money, or the kind that costs time? He had spent most of his life in the first category, and he had known it was the easier one, and he had not found this troubling before. He turned in his bed and thought about the morning in the village, the basket set without ceremony inside the door, the crouch in the mud to speak with a 6-year-old at eye level. He thought about the way she moved through Ashwick Hall, as though she had decided some time ago that the fact of occupying a room did not require anyone else's permission. His wife, Isabel, had moved through rooms in a similar way. He thought about Isabel less than he used to. He was not sure whether this was healing or erosion, and he had never found anyone whose opinion on the question he trusted enough to ask. Isabel had been dead for 3 years, which was long enough that his family had begun to find the subject delicate in a different direction, from the direction of what came next, rather than from the direction of what had been. What had been. A woman who had chosen him before he was worth choosing. A carriage accident on a road he had been meant to travel. A guilt so large and shapeless that he had spent 3 years dressing it in the armor of indifference because he did not know what else to do with it. He lay in the dark and did not sleep, and in the morning he rose at dawn and rode south again toward the village. But this time, she was not there. The house party concluded its 6th day without incident, and on the 7th day, Mrs. Wrentham made her move. She did it at breakfast, with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for the right audience. Lord Ashwick was present. Miss Wrentham was present. Gideon was present. The table was otherwise thinly populated, which was, he suspected, not an accident. Mrs. Wrentham said, over her 2nd cup of tea, that she had been speaking to her brother about the spring, and that it seemed a fine time for a visit to London, and that Miss Wrentham had had quite enough of the country for the present, and that she had mentioned to Lord Ashwick the possibility of a small entertainment, something intimate, for which certain introductions might be made. She said all of this in the pleasant, particular voice of a woman building a structure brick by brick in public, and daring anyone to name the structure while it was still under construction. Gideon looked at his plate. He had known this was coming. He had known it when Lord Ashwick first invited him, and he had known it when Mrs. Wrentham arrived, and he had known it on the 2nd evening when she positioned Miss Wrentham beside the pianoforte with the precision of a chess player advancing a bishop. He had let it accumulate without objecting, because he had not decided whether to object. He had not decided because he had not felt, until 6 days ago, that he required any particular opinion about the matter. Constance was not at the breakfast table. She took her breakfast early, he had learned, before the company came down, because the morning was when she accomplished the work that required concentration before the house generated its usual noise. He thought about her in the morning room with her accounts and her drainage treatise, and he thought about Mrs. Wrentham's brick-by-brick construction, and he made a decision, quietly, the way he made most decisions, without announcement. He said into the conversation's pleasant hum, "I am afraid a London entertainment in the spring will not find me available, Wrentham. I have too much at Hartwell Park to manage." Mrs. Wrentham's cup paused in its travel toward her lips. Lord Ashwick looked up. Miss Wrentham, who had been examining her toast, continued to examine her toast. "Of course," Mrs. Wrentham said after a moment. "Perhaps another time." "Perhaps," said Gideon, and returned to his breakfast. He found Constance in the long gallery at 10 o'clock, at the table with the accounts. She looked up when he came in and did not look away again, which he had noticed she did not do. She looked at things until she had decided what they were. He sat down across from her. He did not have the drainage treatise as a pretext. "I owe you an apology," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "For what?" she said. And the question was genuine, not rhetorical. She did not know. He had not expected that to make it harder. "On the first evening," he said, "before dinner, I said something to Ashwick that I would not have wished you to hear." She waited. She did not supply the rest. "I repeated his characterization of your position here," Gideon said, "and I made it worse. I said you were indispensable because you had no alternative. I said it as though it were an observation rather than a judgment, which is the kind of thing one tells oneself when one does not wish to examine what one is actually doing." Constance set down her pen. She looked at him with the expression that asked questions. "Why are you telling me now?" she said. "Because I have been in this house for 7 days," he said, "and I have not been able to think of anything more pressing." It was not the kind of answer he was accustomed to giving. He had rehearsed several others and discarded them all, because they were smooth in the way that smooth answers were, and smoothness had begun to seem, in the last 7 days, like a form of cowardice he could no longer afford. Constance was quiet for a long moment. Outside the gallery windows, the November garden was bare and gray and still. "I have heard that said before," she said at last, "in various forms, by various people. Usually they do not trouble to apologize." "I am not apologizing to be unusual," he said. "No," she said. "I know that." She looked at him for another moment, and then something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, but a relaxing of the careful composure she maintained in the general company, the way a room can change when someone opens a window. "What was the other thing?" "The kind that costs time. You never answered." It took him a moment to locate the reference. "The dinner conversation 7 days ago." "I did not," he agreed. "No." "You looked," she said with precision, "as though you had been asked to perform an arithmetic problem in public and were uncertain of the answer." The thing that happened to his face then was not something he planned for. He was aware of it only because of the way she looked at him when it occurred. A quick, startled attention, as though she had not expected it. "The second kind troubles me more," he said. "You were right about that." "Most people find it easier to admit that when they are not in public," she said. "It is harder to say in front of other people." "We are not in front of other people at the moment," he said. "No," she agreed. And then, after a moment, "We are not." He did not return to the question of her position at Ashwick Hall that day or the next. He returned to conversations about drainage and parish accounts and the management of an estate that had been left to him at 26, too young, too sudden, and imperfectly equipped for it. And she talked to him about those things the way she talked about everything, with the clarity of someone who had been required to understand them without the luxury of pretending they were simple. On the 9th day, Mrs. Wrentham told her brother, within Gideon's hearing, that Miss Rowe had been given entirely too much latitude, and that it had produced a certain forwardness that was not quite the thing in a woman of her station. She said it in the corridor outside the library, in the voice of someone who has decided that the audience they have chosen is a safe one. Gideon was in the library. He had not announced his presence. He stood quite still for a moment. Then he set down the book he was holding and walked out into the corridor. And Mrs. Wrentham stopped speaking when she saw him. And Lord Ashwick had the specific expression of a man who wishes he were somewhere else entirely. "Mrs. Wrentham," Gideon said. He kept his voice level, because a level voice carries further than a raised one. "I wonder if I might ask you to clarify what you mean by latitude." Mrs. Wrentham said that she meant no particular criticism, of course, only that certain women in certain positions could sometimes mistake helpfulness for equality, and that it was quite natural, really. One could not blame them, poor things, but it did create a certain awkwardness for the family. Miss Rowe corrected a billing error in the steward's accounts that would have cost this estate £40, Gideon said. She identified a drainage problem that your brother's steward had misdiagnosed and would have charged another $60 to repair incorrectly. She manages correspondence, household organization, and estate planning tasks that would otherwise require a hired man. This does not strike me as a position requiring criticism. Mrs. Wrentham looked at him with the particular expression of a woman recalculating. "I am sure you are right," she said, in an entirely different voice. Lord Ashwick looked at the wall. Gideon returned to the library and stood in front of the window for a long time. He thought about Constance in the corridor outside the drawing room that first evening, refilling an old woman's wine glass when no one was watching. He thought about the child in the mud, and the accounts, and the drainage treatise, and the apology he had given at the long table, which had been the first honest thing he had said in a room at a social occasion in approximately 3 years. He thought about Isabel, and the road, and the guilt that had spent 3 years hardening into armor, because armor was easier to carry than grief. He thought about what he had come to Ashwick Hall to do, and what he had found instead, and whether those two things could be reconciled. And then he stopped thinking about reconciliation because the real question was simpler and more frightening. And he had always been better at simple questions than complicated ones when he finally permitted himself to ask them. If you have found something you did not know you were looking for, do you return to the shape of the life you had without it? He knew his answer. He had known it for 4 days. He had been waiting for the courage to hold it outside his own chest long enough to examine it, and he was not a man for whom courage had ever been difficult in any arena except the one that had no rules. He went to find her. She was in the morning room, not at the writing table but at the window, standing with a cup of tea and looking out at the garden, which was bare and gray and had apparently been absorbing a great deal of contemplation from various directions in the last 9 days. She turned when he came in, and she read something in his face that made her set the cup down carefully on the windowsill. "Mr. Hartwell," she said. He stopped in the middle of the room. There was a stretch of carpet between them, and he was not sure whether to cross it. And he was aware that he had not prepared any of this, which was unlike him, and which felt, strangely, like the correct way to do it. "I have been in this house 9 days, he said, "and I have arrived at a question I cannot leave without asking. I am aware it is soon, and I am aware of the difference in our positions, and I am aware that you have no reason to take anything I say this morning as anything other than the temporary consequence of a country house in November." He stopped. He started again. "I do not believe it is temporary. I would like the opportunity to demonstrate that it is not, if you would permit me to do so." Constance looked at him. The gray-green eyes held that question-asking quality he had noticed the first afternoon, and she was reading him the way she read the accounts, looking for the number behind the number, the problem behind the stated problem. "You are asking permission to court me," she said. "I am," he said. "If that is not an absurdity." "It is a considerable surprise," she said. "I know." She was quiet for what seemed to him like a very long time. The garden outside was still and cold and bare, and the morning room fire crackled once in the silence, and he stood in the middle of the carpet and held the question without trying to fill the silence she was using to think. "I should tell you," she said at last, "that I have nothing. No money, no family, no position beyond what courtesy extends. That my husband's debts were paid but left nothing else. That I am 28 years old and have been described as a spinster in public by people who did not think I could hear them. And that I have heard that word said about myself so often that I have long since stopped minding it. I am telling you this because you should know what you are asking, and I will not have you come to me in 6 months and say you did not understand the entirety of it. He crossed the carpet. He stopped near enough that the distance between them was no longer the distance of a room. He said, his voice quiet, "I understand the entirety of it. I am a widower of 3 years, with an estate that has not been managed as well as it might, a family that wants grandchildren, and a history of substituting other people's opinions for my own when the subject embarrasses me. You would not be acquiring an uncomplicated situation either?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "No, I would not." He asked, and she took 3 days to answer, because she was not a woman who made decisions without examining them from every direction, which was exactly the quality that had brought him to this room in the first place. She thought, and she walked in the bare November garden, and she sat with her tea and her accounts, and on the 3rd day she came to him in the library and stood in the doorway and said, "Yes, with conditions." "Name them," he said, and he meant it. She named them. That she would continue to have work of her own, that he would not make decisions about her life without consulting her first, that she would be introduced to Hartwell Park's books before she agreed to anything in writing, and that if the estate's east drainage problem was anything like Ashwick Hall's, she reserved the right to overrule the steward. He agreed to every condition. He would have agreed to more. They became engaged in the morning room of Ashwick Hall on a Wednesday in November, without an audience, without ceremony, without the machinery of the season, or the marriage market, or the approval of anyone in particular. Lord Ashwick was informed and received the news with a blankness that suggested he was still working out where he had gone wrong in his original calculations. Mrs. Wrentham was informed and said nothing, which was, Gideon thought, the most accurate response available to her. Miss Pemberton, the elderly aunt, wept a small quantity of happy tears and said she had known it would happen the first evening, which was not true, but was kind. Constance told none of this to anyone outside the house, because there was no one outside the house to tell. Her parents were gone. Her husband was gone. Her cousin, who had offered her the position at Ashwick Hall when the debts were settled, sent a brief reply to her letter that wished her well and asked if she would need the post much longer. She read the letter in the morning room, at the window, and then she set it down and looked out at the garden, which had not changed. The gray November light was still thin and pale and entirely without flattery. She found she did not require flattery. If you were to ask her what she felt, standing at that window on the day she had said yes to a man she had not known 12 days before, she would have said something like a surprised steadiness, the kind that comes not from certainty that everything will be easy, but from certainty that the thing is real. She had been in enough rooms where the real thing and the performed thing looked identical from the outside to know the difference from the inside. This was the real thing. She did not know everything about him, and he did not know everything about her. And the rest of it was the work of years, not days. She was not afraid of the work. On the last morning of the house party, before the carriages were brought around, Gideon came to find her in the long gallery one final time. She was not at the writing table. She was standing at the window, as she had been standing at the morning room window when he asked, because she was a woman who thought best at windows, in the gray light that did not flatter anyone. He stood beside her. They were looking at the same bare garden. "Hartwell Park's East Field," he said. "I intend to look at it in February," she said. "The drainage problem will not show itself until the thaw." "I know," he said. "I will make sure we are there in February." She turned her head and looked at him, and the question-asking quality in her face resolved, just for a moment, into something that had no name and did not need one. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked out of the long gallery together, and the November light came in behind them, thin and pale and entirely unhurried, and fell across the writing table where the accounts were closed and set aside, and the chair where she had sat for 8 months being useful in the way of someone who had decided that useful was enough, until a man came in with no particular intention, and found, in the careful work of her hands and the straight line of her back, and the question her eyes always asked, the answer to something he had not known he was missing. The carriage for Hartwell Park was ready at 11. He handed her in, and she settled with her small case in the seat, and she looked out the carriage window as they pulled away from Ashwick Hall's gray stone front, and she did not look back. She had always been better at forward than back. She had said so once, to a curate who had loved her, and it had been true then. And it was true now. The carriage turned south onto the road, and the bare November trees closed in around it, and the thin pale light moved along with them for a while, as thin pale light does, following without promise. And then the clouds shifted somewhere above the tree line, and the light changed, and the road ahead opened up wide and bright, and Constance, who would be Constance Hartwell by spring, felt the warmth of it through the glass on her face, and was, for the first time in longer than she could name with any precision, entirely satisfied. If her story has stayed with you, leave a word about her in the comments. She has earned the recognition. The window held the light a little longer after the carriage had gone. As windows do, the bare trees stood their ground. Somewhere inside Ashwick Hall, the steward's account sat in a closed ledger on the long table, finished in the careful hand of a woman who had already moved on, having done the work exactly and having required nothing in exchange except the chance to do it again, somewhere warmer, for someone who saw what the work was. She would have February at Hartwell Park. She would have the Eastfield and the drainage problem, and a man who had listened when she told him to look further up the slope. And that, as it turned out, was more than enough.